listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Let's talk. And I am Halli Casser-Jayne. Welcome to my listeners in the United States and around the world. Tune in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show at hallicasserjayne.com. This week on the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, I talk with two smart, sassy, dynamic women, both who've chronicled their well-lived lives in their new memoirs. Up first, a visit with Joan Juliet Buck, the first and only American woman ever to fill the coveted position of Editor-in-Chief of Paris Vogue, and whose new book is the eye-opening The Price of Illusion. And in our second half hour, the equally dynamic model, actress, writer, Fiona Lewis, the author of a candid new memoir, Mistakes Were Made, Some in French. You're in for two truly fascinating conversations today on the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Let's get to it. Joan Juliet Buck, the only child of larger-than-life film producer Jules Buck, was born into a world of make-believe. Her childhood was a whirlwind of famous faces: Joan Huston, Peter O'Toole, Lauren Bacall, Federico Fellini, and many more. Ever-changing home addresses, London, Paris, Cannes, Los Angeles, and the unspoken lesson that appearances mattered more than reality. When Joan became the first and only American woman ever to fill the coveted position of Editor-in-Chief of Paris Vogue, she quickly became a force in the cult of fashion and beauty. Her job gave her the means to recreate for her aging father, now a widower, the life he'd enjoyed during his high-flying years, a splendid illusion of glamour and luxury. But such illusions cannot be sustained indefinitely, and they always come at a cost. In her new book, The Price of Illusion, Joan offers up a dazzling, compulsively readable memoir spanning 6 decades. But when Joan's fantasy life at Vogue came to an end, she had to find out who she was after all those years living in the land of make-believe. What is the price of illusion? Let's talk. What a book, girlfriend. I got to tell you what. Whoa. All right? Hear me? Whoa. This is truly so. But I got to say to you, Joan, Barbara Taylor Bradford, Danielle Steele, Judith Krantz, they got to move over because your life is like a Danielle Steele novel. I mean, this is some story. It's a gosh darn saga. I mean, it's really a great memoir. So much fun to read and so sad too, and so many emotions. So I just wanted to start by telling you that because it really did bowl me over. So here we go. How was it sitting? You're welcome. You're welcome. I don't always say that either. Trust me. But what was it like sitting down and facing the whole cold, hard reality that was your life? That's got to be a tough thing to sit down and say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to look at it. Talk to me.
Yeah. Well, I was very lucky because when I sat down, I had nothing left to lose.
Yeah.
I didn't belong to a company. I wasn't in a relationship. I was just alone. And therefore, it was really interesting. The first draft was over 1,000 pages. I kind of wrote it like a deposition because having had this life, I wrote the book to figure out exactly what had happened and why it happened and how it happened. When I came back to America after Paris Vogue, people wanted to meet the iconic editor-in-chief of Paris Vogue, which I was not. I was a writer who spoke French, who was hired for that job, who did it for not quite 7 years. That was not my identity. All these strange things happened in my life. They were wonderful and they were awful. So I wrote the first 1,050 pages. I wrote down everything. And my editor said, whoa, cut this down. And it was extraordinary because so much of my life is gone. My parents, whom I adored, Ricky Houston, my godfather's wife, who I adored even more than my mother, the places I'd lived, the things I'd known. And there I was in my loft in New York and in this tiny little place in the country sometimes, working, writing 12, 16 hours a day, writing until 4 in the morning, getting up late, drinking my coffee, remembering to eat some food about 4 hours later. That's where the eggs come in. In this kind of trance of memory. And I had diaries, I had photos, I had all kinds of boxes full of little pieces of paper to remind me of stuff that I had kept all my life. But each successive draft, I was trying to hone in on what's the real story? Because there's so many stories here, as my editor said. What's the story? And the more I rewrote and cut down, my rewriting was cutting down. It was like, you know that thing the sculptor says, I have to find the sculpture in the piece of stone?
Yeah, sure.
And I had to find the story in the mass of words. And I cut out a great many incidents, a great many friends, because they were things that didn't actually connect to the true story, which is my total devotion to my father, my blind devotion to my father, my kind of suspicion of my mother, which, you know, turned out, anyway, that's...
Right, let's keep some secrets. Let me move on. Yeah. Let me move on with you on this, because this is something that I noticed right in the beginning. I have to, there's a lot in The Price of Illusion, as you know, having edited down, there still is this just gorgeous, well, because you know, yours is a life well lived. Here's what I found astonishing, though. The Price of Illusion, but the very first thing that caught my eye, Joan, listen to me. You might have been living in Fantasyland, but even as a child in Paris, as you tell your story, you had this keen eye for detail about truth. That astonished me. I mean, how do you square that up with the fact that you traveled in this circle of illusion? You knew truth. Even if you played the other, your core was truth. Were you aware of that, or are you aware of that, or am I just telling you something you didn't know?
You're telling me something that I'm taking as the most enormous compliment.
It is. I meant it as one.
Because, well, yeah, I can hear. Because for me, in writing the book, obviously I was reliving all these things, and I had the photos and everything to help me. But I was putting together, you know, the evidence of my eyes, of my ears, of my fingers, what I touched, what I saw, what I tasted, what I smelled. And I think that I was probably so attached to surface, to the way things looked, and to the surface of things and the way they felt physically under my hands, because they were real. The things were real. Even if, say, the Pink Marble Palace was only a rental and it wasn't even my parents paying for it, it was my grandparents. But when I touched the marble statues, they were real.
And you gleamed on to real.
My reality.
Yeah. Huh? And you glommed on to real in the rest of the crazy, I think. Fascinating.
Yes, and my relationship is always, you know, I cook for myself. I'm very happy when I'm chopping vegetables slowly and carefully. I'm very happy when I'm washing my underwear and drying it in the sun. I don't know how to garden or at all, you know. I can't sing, but I know how to do certain things in physical reality that absolutely ground me. And whenever there's a crisis in my life, I make a chicken soup from scratch.
A nice Jewish girl. I love it. Listen to me, your parents and your uncle, before we get into the celebrity types, you were surrounded by genes that are colorful. I mean, right?
Yes, indeed. My beloved uncle.
I love that man. Talk to me about, in short spurts, because I got a lot to ask you and time flies. But talk to me a little bit about first your mom, then your father, and if you want to throw in a little bit about the uncle, just to give us a picture of where you were coming from, because I think it's important.
Okay. My mother was a stunningly beautiful child who went on stage at the age of 9 in Chicago during the height of the Depression to feed her family. She was talented, she was beautiful, she was intelligent, and she was always one of the most beautiful women in the world. And she smiled a lot. And through the hard times, she smiled more and more. And then she developed something called trigeminal neuralgia that was a very painful condition that I decided came from all that smiling. Mm. My father was born in St. Louis. He had a perfect eye for symmetry, for detail. He became a photographer very young as a teenager. He went out to Hollywood as kind of a paparazzo working for Photoplay and Modern Screen and Esquire, and he took photographs. And he took some very important photographs in his life. He became a cameraman, a producer, and he knew reality as what he saw, but he was also exceptionally good at creating a better reality. He turned Peter O'Toole into the biggest movie star in the world because he believed in him and he knew how to do it. And when he lost everything, it broke his heart, and it also broke my heart because we were so close.
Right.
And then I back to him.
The other part that I do want to put in here, because I'm Jewish, and I think that you can't be, that thing that just penetrates through you, whether you want it to or you don't. You understand it, you don't. Whether you practice it or you don't, there is something in that, and I related, I suspect, to a lot of the illusion that you grew up around, because I did too. And I thought to myself when I was reading it, Joan, it's interesting what Jewish people did in those days to create the illusion, so they could step into the other world that seems so far away.
Well, there's the wonderful thing in Hannah Arendt's The Jew is Pariah, where she's talking about how the refugees in the 30s in America pretended they'd been grander in Europe, and she tells the story of the Dachshund who says, "Back home, I was a Great Dane."
It's so true. It's so true, right?
And I also think there's a fundamental Jewish thing about being a wanderer. And no matter how much I attempt to put down roots here and there, I now know at my advanced stage I'm a wanderer. So I need my textiles that fold up, that can go on the floor or the wall or the furniture, and I will make my world out of the surfaces that I can apply to my environment.
So well said, and so the essence of what the story of your life is all about. You were brought up in Europe mostly, and your parents left after the crazy McCarthy thing happened in Hollywood. I find that interesting too. Bilingual, obviously. Tell us about your dad then, when he remakes himself in Europe and he comes across Peter O'Toole.
He'd had 5 difficult years in Paris, living basically in places that my mother's parents rented. And we went to London. He did a TV show called OSS. He started this movie called The Day They Robbed the Bank of England with an old friend of him. He's a writer called John Brophy. He discovered Peter O'Toole, and he did it he had ways of talking about people and things that made them sound very important. I think that was part of it. And he always said, don't run after things. Let them come to you. And he also said, when things aren't coming to you, do something for somebody else.
Interesting. Great lessons he taught you, yes?
Yes. The only job I ever really, really wanted was features editor of British Vogue. And I wanted that job so badly that I would, burst into tears. It belonged to a well-born woman called Marina Warner, who'd been to Oxford, who was English. I was none of those things. I got the job when I was 23. And once I'd gotten that job, everything else kind of happened and came to me, if you will. So that was the sum total of my ambition.
Well, that's not a bad ambition. Not everybody would have that on their radar for what they want to do with the rest of their life, if you will. So that's they gave you ambition. You could say what you wanted about your parents and their world, but driven? Did you feel driven? Did you feel you had accomplished something for them, for yourself?
I felt my father, who was born in St. Louis, valued the fact that his tiny little daughter spoke French like a native. This was probably the most important thing about me to him. And all the way through the book and all the way through my life, say it in French, honey, he would go. Say it in French. Speak French. So in some kind of terrible way, when I was offered the job of editing Paris Vogue, which I didn't particularly want, but it was an opportunity to speak French. So in a way, that was fulfilling what my father wanted for me more than what I wanted for myself.
So that's the theme. The theme is always wanting to please Daddy.
Pleasing Daddy was a very big deal. And also, I trusted him completely because I could see his goodness, his generosity, and his heart. And then when he became increasingly unstable after having lost everything, and after a break-in in my parents' apartment in 1983 where he was pistol whipped.
Yeah, and let's not gloss over that. Let me stop you there.
Okay.
That's too important to your story.
Okay.
All right, let's go to this. Let's go from you're in Europe, now you're back in California, and your parents have this horrible thing happen. Tell us about what happened.
I was actually in Europe. My parents were living in Los Angeles, and one Sunday morning, 4 guys got into their apartment, pistol whipped my father, my mother, and said, "Get your wife." My mother came out of the bedroom, and I probably can't say this, I can't repeat on the radio what word she used, but she was very graphic and got the guys out of the apartment. And as a result of this trauma, my father became, I don't want to say unhinged, my father, who'd had, during the war, when he was a cameraman on a film called Report from the Aleutians, a documentary that Joan Huston made when they were in the army, one night a Kodiak bear had broken into the tent where the soldiers slept. And he had been terrified by this Kodiak bear. After the break-in, my poor father thought he was possessed by a Kodiak bear. And he had what you might call an episode. I was not there. I flew out to L.A. for my parents' wedding anniversary in January of '84. And my mother told me that my father, she told me in French because somebody was listening, so she's telling me in French, bad French, that my father thinks he's a bear, and I am not understanding what she's talking about. And there's a horrifying scene in the book that I don't even want to relive by describing it now when we get to the apartment. And I got my father to a doctor who diagnosed him as manic depressive and got him on lithium. And then I had to write a great many more magazine articles to take care of my parents for the next few years.
So, for a girl who has her father on this extraordinary pedestal, which I can really relate to have him come down and fall down does what to you, Joan?
It makes you, from even before this horrible moment, from the time that my father lost his money, his status, his partnership with O'Toole, which was in the mid-'70s, I had only one thing in my head, was I wanted to give it back to him. I wanted to restore what he had lost. And I couldn't do it until I was the editor-in-chief of French Vogue, so therefore doing what he wanted me to do, rather than, I had wanted really to go off to Hot Springs, Arkansas and live on Bathhouse Row and try and write a third novel, but I took this job because it seemed silly not to take it, and Dad really wanted me to do it. So here I am, I'm editing French Vogue, Paris Vogue, I'm in Paris, there are expenses, I'm giving lovely parties, I'm wearing nice clothes, all the famous, wonderful, glossy people are coming to my parties, and my father, now a widower, is making bad left turns in the Subaru on Wilshire Boulevard. And I think this is not possible. I cannot let this happen. I brought my father to Paris. For 6 months he lived with me. That was not a good idea. I got him a beautiful apartment overlooking the stamp market, just by the rond-point of the Champs-Élysées, beautiful looking south towards the Grand Palais. I hired an Indian woman called Anita to spend her days with him and have lunch with him and take him to the dentist and the museums and listen to his stories. And when he would come to my dinner parties, which Anita cooked for, he was treated like a king. He was treated like the important person he had once been. So my job at Vogue was able to create the illusion that he'd gotten back everything he had lost.
Great. So let's not stay all in the heavy. Darling.
No, please, let's lighten it up right now.
We're going to lighten it up right now, okay? Men. Let's talk men. I love to talk about men. You've had your fair share. You did marry, you've been divorced. Journalist John Halpern. But here are some names, some of them we may share, but I'm not going to tell you who have been in our lives.
Wahoo!
Okay, honey? But I'm not going there. It's going to be a secret.
Oh, so I have to go there and you don't. Right.
Exactly. That's the way that one goes. All right. Donald Sutherland, Jerry Brown, Brian De Palma. You kissed. Do tell, darling. What was these men? I mean, these were pretty extraordinary men that circled around you, but I know Sutherland was pretty important to you. Talk to me.
Well, what's interesting to me about a man is what's inside his head and how he sees the world and what interests him, much more than, who he is. It's like what's inside the man's head. So these happen to be a few of the men that I have been involved with, each of whom had a very different view of the world and a very consistent view of the world, each of whom intrigued me for a different reason.
Okay. What, not the number one thing in your life, though? Men?
Well, I would fall in love with the man and the way the man was and what the man was interested. When I was in love with Jerry Brown, I set off to to write an essay that took me 9 months about the right to the pursuit of happiness, because it was a question he kept asking. What is the right to the pursuit of happiness? So I went off and wrote this essay inspired by him. It was the inspiration of him more than the reality, in fact. And each of those men inspired me in a different way. There's a piece in Harper's Bazaar this month. They asked me to write about the men in my life, my rocky, my what was the word, tumultuous love life. And I sat down in a friend's patio in Barcelona in December to write this. And the book, I started writing it, but what I love about doing these essays for Harper's Bazaar is I let them take me where they want to go, where the essay wants to go. Leonard Cohen had died around the time of the election. We had met as a flirtation, and then he had become a very close friend. And I had seen him about a year before. I hadn't mourned him. I'd been thinking of other things. And sitting in that patio in Barcelona, I found I didn't want to write a man in my life. I wanted to write about Leonard. And I wrote this essay about him and about our friendship. That's the essay I am proudest of anything I've ever written.
Wow, that's interesting. Question.
Yeah.
So here you are, you're not old.
I'm old. No, I'm 68 years old.
Honey, you're not old, darling. You're getting there.
When I was young, I would fall hard, not only for the man, but as I said, for everything he represented. And this would illuminate my life for the next few years. And I'm not a schemer, I'm not a manipulator, and I never sort of tried to catch anyone. I was interested in the experience of the moment and in the degree of intensity of the connection. But these were like waves of interest, waves of a kind of illumination, and then the wave would subside and it would be over, and then somebody else would come along. I am so relieved to be 68. Yes, I have been involved with various men in the last, since I've been back in America, I've been involved with 3 different men. And I think particularly since I started the book was more important to me than any man or any relationship.
Is it okay to be at this stage of your life and not be married, be living with... Do you know what I'm saying? You could ask me the same question. I'll answer if you want, but you know where I'm going.
But to be completely realistic about it, at this age, I think it would be great if I was of an emotional constitution to have withstood a long marriage. It would be very nice to be with somebody who had met me when I was young and when he was young or younger. And at this age, what one is presenting to a man that one meets. I mean, I had a date a few years ago with somebody, kind of a first date, and I walked in. It was before I'd started dyeing my hair again. He looks at me and he says, "Do you ever dye your hair?" And I thought, the truth of it all, I'm an older woman. What I'm offering is not the luscious, ripe, fabulous sexuality of a younger woman. I'm offering insight, compassion, love, companionship, humor, but the other side of it is, it's probably not as attractive. And when I say offering, I'm an only child. I've spent a lot of my life alone, just alone with the typewriter, alone with the computer. I'm not very good at relationships. My friendships are paramount to me, and some of my friends are exes, and a lot of my friends are men who have never been relationships, but with whom I have a trusting, loving, dignified, fabulous, loyal relationship that's gone on for years. That's fine, because for me to put on high heels and grow my hair long and have a manicure and do all those endless things to make my body look younger than it is, I can't do that. I've got other stuff to do. I've got stuff to write.
You fascinate me, darling. You really, really do fascinate me, because you're so the antithesis of what anybody would ever think, and that's what this great book does. I think it gives you a dimension that those of us who have followed your career would not have really known had we not read this terrific book. Listen to me.
What do you mean the antithesis?
Well, because I really was expecting far more of a non-dimensional person, more of an illusion. So there you go.
We can't be illusion,
right? But
we can, life is tough, life is hard, life has all kinds of weird surprises.
Absolutely.
All we can do is be kind and loving with the people we're close to and also with strangers.
So you get down to real. I think that's the wonderful part of older. You don't give a hoot anymore. I could use other words, but you don't give a hoot anymore, and then you just get down to real. But life takes you to real, and it took you to real, which I think is right. and twice, not once. It took you twice. At the end of the Vogue thing, that was pretty awful. You wind up.
The rehab was fun.
And probably relaxing too. I mean, let's tell that. I mean, when you got fired, or if you will, Newhouse thinks that you're addicted because you're running around drinking seawater, which I get to, and so he says, and then you're addicted, and they send you into rehab. Okay, that's and you return to New York. Having to deal with all of this. This is what the world
to Santa Fe.
Right, to Santa Fe, and that's what the world sees. That sees this big picture. But life goes on, and you got chutzpah, honey, and you do it over and over and over again, and you actually go ahead. You can take it from there. Tell us what happened next, and we only have a few minutes, so do it quickly.
Okay, in the rehab, a jazz great who shall remain nameless. I had a revelation, which I'm not going to explain. It's in the book. I had a big revelation about what I was addicted to. And I said, now I know I'll never do that again. And this jazz great said, watch out for the relapse. The relapse is what kills you. And I said, I'm never going to relapse. My addiction, I can say it now, was to Vogue. And I started working for Vogue again after I came back. And I did whatever Vogue wanted because I wasn't going to tell them what to do because I'd been an editor-in-chief. And if I started telling them what to do, it would be bad energy. And they sent me to Syria. And I wrote this interview. I took the assignment. I wrote this interview, and it came out to universal censure. And then Vogue canceled my contract.
Well, let's say who the interview was with. It was with Bashar Assad's wife, the butcher of Syria, if you will. And
who had not started butchering anybody.
Right, and that's well put. And she is an absolutely exquisite woman, and she's the Syrian version of our Jackie Onassis kind of lady. So you just
she's British,
and you did it in at a time that it was she was a curiosity, and you got nailed for it.
Yeah, yes,
okay, indeed. So that was the end of that. But that one knocked you. That's what got you to write the book and say, wait, stop. Yes. I got to get off the train and take a look. Right?
Yes, because I no longer belonged to anybody. I was out in the cold. I was the scapegoat, and in the book I write about the scapegoat. They didn't kill the scapegoat. They sent the scapegoat out into the desert. I went out into the scapegoat. What does the scapegoat do? Wanders through the desert. It eats some leaves off the bushes. It drinks from the streams. Maybe it finds another village. Maybe it's the new goat in the new village. Maybe it finds another goat with whom to make baby goats. And I went out. Everything that I had had around me in my life from the age of 19 was stripped away, and finally I was free of my protection that I had been attached to, that I had stayed under all my life, but I was free also to find out who I'd been, where I'd been, what it meant, and free to write my book.
There are people who say reality is hell and illusion is heaven. What do you say?
Are there?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I think illusion is candy and reality is spinach. I mean, reality, it's, you can't live on candy. You'll get diabetic really fast and your teeth will fall out.
I've been speaking with Joan Juliet Buck, author of a remarkable memoir, The Price of Illusion, available at fine bookstores everywhere and online at Amazon.com. You are listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. My guests today are Joan Juliet Buck, the author of The Price of Illusion, and Fiona Lewis, the author of Mistakes Were Made, Some in French. Tune in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Nearly 300 episodes available at hallicasserjayne.com. We'll be back in a minute. Stay with us. Hi, this is Halli Casser-Jayne. Are you enjoying the show? I hope so. And I hope that you'll tell your friends about it and help us grow our family. How can you help? That's easy. Share the link to the show with your friends or my show's player. And I would love it even more if you'd recommend they visit my website at hallicasserjayne.com. I look forward to seeing all of you there. Model, actress, writer, Fiona Lewis has led the life of which dreams are made. Smart, savvy, beautiful. Her acting credits include Roman Polanski's The Vampire Killers, Ken Russell's Listomania, and Brian De Palma's The Fury. She is the author of the novel Between Men. Her writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The Observer, and the Los Angeles Times. And she may be, which she candidly admits, the only woman in America who has written for The New Yorker and posed for Playboy. One marriage didn't work, one has, but then, just when life seemed to be singing along famously, Fiona Lewis woke up one morning asking herself that proverbial question songstress Peggy Lee once asked, "Is that all there is?" She answers her own questions in her new, dishy, and candid memoir, Mistakes Were Made, Some in French. Let's talk.
Hi there.
Hi there. I'm just fine, thank you very much. And how are you?
Well, I'm doing great, thank you.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it. Thanks for being on the show. Thank you for this lovely, lovely, important book. I think it's very important. Let me set it up for the listeners. First of all, let me say this. Isn't life a beautiful bitch? I mean, it really is. One day, right? It's the truth. One day you wake up and there it is demanding that you hit that midlife thing and it's going, reassess, make some tough choices.
And do something.
And do something. Been there, done that. I'm right along with you. But you begin the book when you seemingly have it all. You're living in beautiful La La Land with your beautifully successful husband, Art Linson, an American film producer. Let's give him some credit, right? Director, screenwriter.
Right.
The Untouchables, one of my favorite movies, Fast Times at Ridgemont High. And then you become aware that life just isn't all that beautiful. So tell us about the beginning of this, listen to me, beautiful adventure of self-discovery. The first thing you noticed that what was gone was your sense of optimism?
Yes, that's right. And I couldn't pin it down to anything because, as you say, I had everything. My life was perfect. So why was I depressed? Why couldn't I get out of bed in the morning? And I felt quite guilty about, having this lovely life when you consider other people's. And then I started to think, well, it seems to me that everything that was going to happen to me has happened already. And what am I going to do with myself? Who am I? You can't rest on your laurels and say, well, I used to be an actress. I used to be this. And I was also having problems with my career as a writer. I didn't feel confident anymore. And so I thought, well, what am I going to do? I have to reinvent myself somehow. I can't give up because, I'm in my 50s. I've probably got a few decades to go. So by chance, I happened to go and stay with a friend of mine who has a farmhouse in southwest France, which is a rather unknown area. Not at all, not expensive, not chic. And I realized that I could actually buy a ruin there for not very much money. And I suddenly saw this as a project to reinvent myself, to give myself self-worth and see if I could do it, basically. It was a big challenge.
I love this story. Can I just tell you, I love this. I'm pea green with envy. I did a 1767 farmhouse once, but not in the south of France.
Oh.
So listen to me.
Oh.
Right. Well, we can talk about that another time. The story of the renovation of the chateau and your life, they coordinate. They go together. It's together. It's a renovation of life, a renovation of this beautiful, beautiful farmhouse or country chateau, really. But before we get into that, I want to go back to your beginnings because they're fascinating too. And I think we are our prelude, right? You were born in Westcliff-on-Sea. Boy, that's such a sexy name. In Essex, England. It sounds
It wasn't very sexy.
I know, but
it was a sweet little seaside town, a sleepy little seaside town.
It's a dreamy town. You're sort of dreamy. You're a dreamer. You're creative. A lady of big ideas. How'd that get into your bones?
I have no idea because I have to say in those days in England, my family were very English and it was not done to encourage your children too much in case they were spoiled, which we certainly weren't terribly. So you really had to find your own way. And I must say, though, my mother was very creative. She was one of those wives who made dresses out of curtains and made do and made everything herself. So I was creative. I just didn't have a clue what I could possibly be. And maybe, I don't know, by going to London and becoming a model and then, sharing an apartment with Jackie Bissett and then sort of slipping into acting, which it was all very vague. In those days you could actually sort of slip into acting from being a model. I don't think you can do that anymore. And then I was always writing. I was writing poetry, and so I obviously had this artistic bent. I just had no idea how to channel it. I think these days one's parents would have immediately put one somewhere and to expand that. But in those days, girls were really thought of as still, you get married and have children, and that'll be fine.
Right.
And so those were the days.
Times changed, though, and I want to talk to you about this because I know you went to boarding school and in France,
right.
And France touched you, I guess, in a way that the UK didn't. Why?
Well, but I first of all, I felt completely liberated. I went there to University of Grenoble, which is a town at the foot of the French Alps. And I went, can you believe I was sent there on my own at 16? But I was, and I was supposed to be looked after by this woman in a pension with other students, but of course she didn't really care. We could do what we liked. So it really was a complete freedom. I didn't speak French, but I got a French boyfriend, and I didn't bother really to go to school. And I mean, it really was an awakening, and also in something about the French language. And I'd also been on holiday with my parents to Saint-Tropez when I was a child. I had this affinity with France that I didn't really realize, but I did, and somehow I blossomed, and I always dreamed of going back to France, even though I went in a different direction.
I'm going to have to change the way I say France to France, because I sound like a lousy, rotten American with no class.
You're right, it took France. But there's something about the language and the history of France that appealed to me, and the food. And you can imagine if you've grown up in the countryside in England, raining every day. And also in those days, the food was pretty bad. And then you go to France, and suddenly it's completely different. I mean, even my childhood in Saint-Tropez, suddenly just sitting in the sun for a start and drinking coffee and croissant. I mean, it was just very exotic compared to growing up in a small town in England.
It's interesting to me because one of the things I got in reading the book is that you see things, and what you see, you sort of make happen in your way. And that fascinates me when there are people like that in the world. And I have a lot of friends like that who do that, but not everybody does. So there's something instilled in you, that you carried France with you, and then what? How many years later you make the dream come true, but it had been instilled in you as a child. So I think that's interesting, Dr. Halli says. Beautiful. Go ahead. If you
sorry.
Yeah,
yes,
no.
I think that, here's what I think looking back, is that when you're young, if you can travel with your parents and open your horizons, it's really important for a child, because you do live in this tiny world of where you grow up, in your house and your schools, and it just gives you a much better understanding of the world and other people's situation and languages. And I think that it's a great education if you can travel, and show your children things.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Widening the horizon is key to it all. It also takes the fear out. It takes borders out of your life symbolically, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's so important. You don't have prejudice against other people. You see the world as made up of all sorts of races and different habits. And so I think that is very important. You're right.
So listen to me, Fiona. You were also given a great gift. You are stunning, darling, even today. I'm going to say it. It's a fact. It's quite a right. Did you recognize your beauty as your single greatest asset? What did you consider it an asset? Did you even come to think of it in terms of, I am beautiful?
No. When I was younger, here's what's interesting. I didn't get on very well with my mother, not through any fault of hers, which I realized later, but she was not a very encouraging I don't think she ever told me I was pretty or loved me, but that was very British, and I didn't really think much of it. But if you don't have that instilled in you when you're young, that your self-worth and you are attractive and pretty as a girl and maybe smart, it's very difficult, because what happens is that you then look to be admired through men, which is not a good way to start out as a woman. You don't have any self-worth unless it's through a man telling you you're pretty, you're beautiful, which is not a good thing at all. So I didn't really think I thought I was pretty, but there were lots and lots of pretty girls in London in the 60s, and I shared a bed sitter with Jackie Bissett, who wasn't bad herself.
You got to tell me about that. Tell the audience, because, the two of you together, what in the world?
It was funny. Here we were. We'd both come from the countryside, and in those days, even the smart parts of Chelsea had these sort of broken down houses that they'd loosely changed into flats, which meant the bathroom was one floor down and the phone was 3 floors down, so that by the time you got there it had run off, and so you could never get the phone call. And we, the little hot plate, it was really pretty sparse to live in. But, we didn't care. We were young and modeling, but we had no money whatsoever. We would literally toast pieces of bread in front of the electric fire, and, we lived on canned sardines. We had no money at all and no food, and you just, some nice guy would take you to dinner. It was very Spartan until then we sort of slid into movies, so we had a bit more money, and then Jackie moved to LA because she had a part in Bullet with Steve McQueen, which was kind of launched her career.
Amazing, right? And you, look what happens to you. I think it's hilarious what happens to you. Your film career, the beautiful Fiona winds up kind of being like the queen of vampire movies, horror
queen
films.
Of the bees, yes. I slid into these sort of horror movies. I found my niche, although I didn't really know what I was doing, but people seemed to like me as a scary girl, and I did all these pretty mediocre horror pictures. I did a couple of, at the time, Ken Russell, your audience probably wouldn't know who he was, but he was a big director, and he did a flashy movie called Listomania with Ringo Starr and Roger Daltrey of The Who, a sort of spoof on Franz Liszt, the composer. So I had a large part in that, and there were a couple of good movies, but you're right, I did become a sort of horror heroine.
It's hilarious to think of it, because you're such a stunning girl, as I said. Roman Polanski, talk to me about that, because that was your first part, right, in The Fearless Vampire Killers.
Right, my very first part was in The Fearless Vampire Killers, which, again, was a horror movie, but it was Roman Polanski, so it was his comic take on horror movies. I knew him when he'd just come over from France, and he didn't speak English very well, and we had an affair. And he was this young, extremely boyish. He looked incredibly young, enthusiastic, full of life, very intelligent, Polish man who had done a couple of movies in Poland and had won many awards. So he was very new and quite revered in London. And he gave me a small part as a serving maid in his horror movie, where I had a few lines which he literally taught me how to say every word, because I hadn't a clue what I was doing. But I parroted him and copied what he said, and I managed to pull them off. But on that movie was Sharon Tate, whom he met and fell in love with, and we were all friends at the time, and she was wonderful and quite magical, actually, as a person.
What about him? What's the key with him?
The thing with Roman is that he has this joie de vivre. He has all this energy for life and this enthusiasm, and he loves art and music and movies, and he's entranced by everything, and so you get sort of swept along. He is somebody who's, he's very boyish in that way, so that is attractive, and he's just, his energy is, it's attractive. A man who has that much energy and love for life, which he does. When you think of his background, of how he lived in the streets in Poland because his parents were. Well, his mother at least was taken off to the concentration camp, right. So he was an orphan in the street. But I didn't know that then, and so he was just this amazing, sort of vital person. He's like a young boy. He's not very tall, but then he looked very young.
But it's interesting to me, the people who you crossed paths with, and as we go along, we'll talk about some of the others, because that seeps into who you become, too. There's no way that it can't. I want to talk to you about something that you talk about in the book that I think is very courageous and very honest of you, and that's the 60s and how the rules changed for women. You're a little bit older than I am, but I came of age, suffered the same way that you did, and I think most of my girlfriends, in fact, I was just with some of my college friends recently, and we were talking about that. Women's lib, sexual freedom for girls, it was far more psychologically complicated time for young women than we ever talk about. And it needs to be talked about because, people romanticize a lot of it and they celebrate a lot of it. But there was a price to be paid for it for young girls like you and myself in that, and mistakes were made. You talk about it, so talk to me a little bit more about that sexual freedom.
Well,
oh boy,
was interesting is the leap from the 50s to the 60s was enormous. I mean, it was very staid, the 50s, and then suddenly the 60s came along. And it's miniskirts and women and men are equal and free love. But basically it was all about sex. It was about everybody sleeping with everybody else, which we all pretended was groovy and cool. But deep down, when you're 18 years old, and you don't know how to handle that. And it isn't sort of cool because, you didn't get a guy calling you the next day. You didn't get any flowers. You got nothing. You just got, he was on to the next girl. And it didn't sit well. And yet you didn't like to mention it because you were supposed to be so cool. So we were all rather unhappy about it. And deep down, nothing much has changed. Everybody was looking for romance. But there wasn't much romance. There was a lot of free love and sex, but there wasn't a lot of romance. And also, there weren't a lot of drugs in those days. There was a lot of drinking because basically just to kind of get through a one-night stand, you drank a lot. At least I did, and I was pretty miserable then. I felt completely lost, but I certainly didn't want to, discuss it. And in those days, women, certainly not my women friends, you didn't talk about sex. It was very new. You didn't talk about the problems of relationships. Well, there wasn't even, the word relationship didn't even exist then. So it was tricky times. And
I think that's important to remember. And I also think that along with that, there are a lot of women who bear a lot of scars to that they either don't address, or they keep to themselves, or they only keep it to a very small amount of people. So I really wanted to touch on that with you because I think that I haven't read that in any other book, a memoir that I've read of people of our, so to speak, generation. At the same time, though, my friend, you also posed nude for Playboy. Are you kidding? I would have died before I would have done that. What was that? What was that like?
Well, I'll tell you what. I came to America and I came to do a movie, but it was sort of a few months ahead. And I had no money whatsoever. I actually came to California with $400, which in my innocence, I thought, well, that'll do for a bit, but of course $400 didn't go a long way when you haven't got anywhere to live. So I had no money whatsoever, and they offered to, I said, sure. And you know what? In a strange way, I didn't feel embarrassed about it at all. I wasn't nearly as embarrassed as everybody else who seemed to think for a nice girl from the English countryside this was a terrible thing to do. I didn't think so. And, in a way now, I am glad I did because I don't have that body anymore. So I'm going, oh, well, I really can't say that I was ever embarrassed, although I did notice men looked at me in a slightly different way.
No, I think it's fascinating. I really do. I mean, but I think you have to have a certain self-worth in order to do that, too, or be completely off the wall.
But it was a certain recklessness, I think, yes.
Recklessness, okay, that's a good word to use.
Yes, I had a certain recklessness about it that I didn't really care what people thought. I don't know where that came from either, but it's good to have that to a degree, obviously, not,
When you're young. When you're young. You certainly had your share of interesting men beyond who we've already talked about. Roger Vadim, which I think is hilarious because everybody I talk to of late has a Roger Vadim story. I have a Roger Vadim story, but I'm going to tell you mine.
You do?
Yeah, but I'm not going to tell you mine. You were I don't want to talk about me. We'll talk about you. You were looking for love in all the wrong places, and if so, why?
I kept thinking, and it was that same thing that I mentioned before. I was looking for validation through a man, and so I was a bit of an easy mark. If some man said, "Oh my God, you're gorgeous. I've fallen madly in love with you," I was going, "Okay, I'm in." It never occurred to me to think, and I think this is a problem that a lot of women have. What I thought about the man, only what he thought about me. I never asked myself, well, do I really like this guy? Is he the kind of guy I want to be with? And I didn't. I wanted that attention. I wanted that affection. And so I sort of skipped off to Paris with Roger Vadim, even though I knew really he probably had lots of other girlfriends. But he was good looking and he was seductive in that French way where he makes you feel for that minute that you are the only woman in the world. The French have a way of doing that. So I was captivated. And of course he was famous in France, and so, people, rushed over to him whenever he entered a restaurant. That's very attractive to a young girl, that sort of power. But of course, it didn't last.
Well, did it ever? I mean, those kind of things. But we'll go forward. No. You were looking to find the right place. I think that's obvious in your tale. But there was a line in the book I have to quote from your debonair Uncle Mike. I think it's the Brit version of what Jewish mothers like mine would say, which is, my mother would say, it's just as easy to marry a rich boy as a poor boy back in the day. And your Uncle Mike said, remember, a woman has a choice in life. You can either spend it on your knees scrubbing the kitchen floor, or you can spend it lying on the deck of a yacht in the south of France. Yours to decide. I love that line.
Yes, and I was 7, I think. I was like, wow, okay. And I was, some women, would email me when they read the book and criticize that and say, well, I mean, there are other avenues.
No.
And then I said, well, I was only 7. What did I know?
Yeah, right. No, I think it's a real good thing to put in the back of your head if you got any smarts in the real world, because there is a real world that we all don't want to really address. But
that's
so
right.
you that's it. I mean, you got to get real, lady. Your uncle would have hoped you married one of your lovers, Patrick John Anson, the 5th Earl of
course,
Litchfield.
and so would my mother have loved it too,
but you didn't.
No, I didn't. And of course, as I say in the book, he was the 5th Earl of Litchfield, and he had this enormous, literally a huge stately home in the country with thousands of acres and butlers and, marble ballrooms and so, to the manor born. And really, in those days, he couldn't have married what was called in England a commoner like myself, meaning an ordinary girl who was not from an aristocratic family. But who knows? Times had changed, and my mother certainly thought it might. I was in her good books for a year or two when that was going on. But, I was completely dazzled. When you walk into a house that has sort of canalettos in the hall and, butlers running around, it is very seductive for a nice upper-middle-class girl from the countryside.
Oh, that's an understatement if ever I've heard one.
It really was. And of course, I wasn't, I wasn't that comfortable because I didn't really know how you were supposed to. Now, of course, I know that it doesn't matter at all, but, always that's the thing, trying to be someone else and not being who you really are.
Right.
That doesn't work with a man.
But you did marry Hollywood royalty. You married Bill Hayward, the son of movie star Margaret Sullivan, associate producer of Easy Rider. That didn't go well either. And God, what a sad end he had to his life.
Well, he certainly did have a sad end, and I didn't put that in the book because it happened not too long ago.
Right.
He was, it's very hard for children of movie stars to find their way in life because they look at their parents and they can't compete. Very few of them, maybe Michael Douglas is one of the few ones, become actors or producers of any note. It's just they can't do it, and then they feel, lost and failures. And that was the way with Bill Hayward. He didn't really find his way. He wasn't really suited to be a movie producer. He should have done something else. I'm not quite sure what. And at a very early age, of course, he was packed off to what would now literally be called a mental institution for some mild infraction at school about a girl. And it was it was a time when, psychoanalysis was fashionable, and everybody maybe not everybody, but a lot of people in Hollywood sent their children off to shrinks who then packed them off somewhere, and it absolutely destroyed his life. And really it was because they were too busy doing other things. So it was,
that whole family, it was a tragedy. But the whole family was riddled with that kind of mental anguish.
Tragic, and of course I thought when I married him, well, I can fix him. But of course you can't. I wasn't really the right person to fix him.
Better you fix chateaus than you fix people. People are hard.
Or fix myself.
I hear you, darling. I hear you loudly and clearly. We're all working on that. That's a work in progress. You did find,
that's a work.
Right? I'll tell you. But you found art, and it worked. How come?
But I found out, and this was something, that I wasn't, he was a completely different kind of man that I'd been used to, because he absolutely told me the truth every day about everything that was who I was and what was happening and what I had to face up to, and I was horrified by this. But of course, in a way, it was exactly what I needed, because I'd never confronted who I was or anything. But he would, And he was very helpful in a very direct Jewish way that I was not, I hadn't been used to. So it was bumpy, lots of arguments. But also what's interesting is that I hadn't really ever been with a man who was just very kind. I know it sounds sort of corny, but I think that people sort of dismiss kind men as maybe not being very interesting. But it is something that's the one thing my mother told me right young. She said, try and find a kind man. But I thought, well, what does that mean? That sounds boring. But in a way, I think it's true. Someone who actually appreciates who you are for what you are and doesn't mind if you mess up now and again.
It's interesting.
It's a hard thing.
Kindness is key, but you can't have a kind man until you know how to be kind to yourself.
That's right, and how to appreciate kindness.
Right.
It's
that you're worthy of
for
it.
most young. Yes, that you're worthy of. That's right. You have to be able to accept kindness. That's another thing that takes a while. And I think for young women, it also sounds a bit boring.
Yeah, right. Exactly. But that's just part of the growing up process. Question for you, which is you didn't have children, but he has children, I guess, that you sort of helped raise.
Right. Well, they were quite grown up when we got together. They were 15 and 17, so they were already sort of grown up, and I don't think they thought much of me, and I couldn't blame them, frankly. I was the interloper, but I understood that, and so I didn't make too much of it.
You've been together now, how long, you two?
Well, we've been together 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, come on. All my marriages put together aren't 1/30th of that. I mean, I need to spend some time with you.
We're legendary in Hollywood.
Legendary is the understatement. Listen to me. You work things out. It's clear to me by the end of the book that why you wrote it was because you were sharing something of self-realization, which I think is always a wonderful thing to do. And at the end of the day, you have to say to yourself, is anything perfect?
That's right, is anything perfect? And my answer to everything in life was, I'm going to escape. I'm going to go somewhere else. I'm going to leave this man and find something else. And in the end, you just have to stop and see what you have as opposed to what you don't have. And that's a hard lesson to learn, and say, look at what I have, and to be grateful for what you have. And I was always at the slightest hiccup running away because I didn't want to face, basically me, maybe changing me to be something else and deal with a relationship.
Not change, reinvent. Listen, the last thing that I want to talk to you about is this. You have the chateau, which he kind of didn't want to get involved with because he was a nice Jewish boy who wanted to stay in L.A. and not go to this foreign planet called France and spend a lot of time.
France, where he didn't speak the language.
Exactly. He wasn't in control there. You can tell him I said so. That's why he wanted to stay in L.A.
That's right, of course.
Right, those men.
You're so right.
But you worked it out and you're still together, and there you are. You've got this beautiful chateau. Everybody's got to go to the website. I'll give it at the end of the show so that you can see this thing. Oh my God, what she's built. What a creative soul you are. But finish this sentence for me, the title of the book, Fiona. Mistakes were made. Fiona, mistakes were made and?
The mistakes were made and I learned to live with them and be happy.
I've been speaking with Fiona Lewis, the author of Mistakes Were Made, Some in French. For more information about Fiona Lewis and her French chateau, visit Fiona's blog at Fiona'sFrenchChateau.com. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a production of Resec LLC. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show posts new podcasts Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern. Visit HalliCasser-Jayne.com.